Please welcome Dan McLaughlin, Jason Miyares, Ian Rowe, and Andy McCarthy.
All right, greetings. Welcome to our panel on the Constitution. I'm Dan McLaughlin, senior writer and fellow at NRI. I'd like to start by thanking the Apricity Foundation, our sponsor for this panel, for helping make this possible. Start with introducing we've got a great panel for you here. First, we have Ian Rowe, who is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, putting his money and mouth where his mind is, a co-founder of the Vertex Partnership Academies, a virtues-based charter high school in the Bronx. Next, we have Jason Miyares, the Attorney General of Virginia, a former prosecutor, a former member of the Virginia General Assembly, which is the oldest elected legislature in the Western Hemisphere. And he is also the proud son of a mother who fled communist Cuba, penniless and homeless, to pursue the American dream. And finally, we have, also from the Bronx, Andy McCarthy, who probably all of you know, needs little introduction, also a former prosecutor, as well as someone you've probably seen on Fox News, in addition to around NR. So I want to start off, Ian, maybe you can get this started a little bit. When I think about, I sometimes think how strange it is that we pack like 100 people into a big metal tube with fake bird wings on it and launch it into the air and just hope it stays up. But we take it for granted that it works. And I think our Constitution is a little bit like that. When it was written in 1787, there was no other country in the world that had a written rule book imposed by the people on the government. And today, we're still the only country in the world that has a written rule book like that, to the point that it was written in the 18th century, to the point where we have judges sitting around reading 18th century dictionaries to tell the president what he's allowed to do. And the American people have mostly accepted this state of affairs. So the Constitution is a legal document, it's a governing document, but it's also this charter of citizenship. How do we pass on that understanding to the next generation?
Yeah, so good morning, everyone. Thank you, Dan. And I'm really honored to be here, especially to speak about the Constitution, because you said it was founded in 1787, but it is not guaranteed. Every rising generation needs to understand this document, why it's been created, how it is become this system of self-governance. And if we don't have a deliberate, intentional effort to teach it to our children, it will dissipate in value. And so at our school, and I have a slide that I'd love to share, we decided, one of the first decisions we made at Vertex Partnership Academies, which is our international baccalaureate charter high school in the Bronx, was to organize ourselves around the 4 cardinal virtues of courage, justice, temperance, and wisdom. And we chose these virtues, the cardinal virtues. The cardinal comes from the Latin root cardo, which means hinge. So the cardinal virtues, all other standards of moral excellence, emanate from these 4 virtues. So resilience, gratitude, optimism, determination, perseverance, all of those emanate from these. And all of our students memorize what we call these I statements. So justice is I uphold our common humanity and honor the inherent dignity of each individual. Or temperance, I lead my life with self-discipline because I am responsible for my learning and behavior. So this became the set of agreements, essentially, because these virtues define how we as a community agree to interact with each other. And so then the question is, well, what document should we study that has demonstrated itself to be really, really effective at being at preserving a system of self-governance? And so we decided the Constitution, obviously, should be that document. So every morning, our students recite the preamble to the Constitution. And it's really powerful, if you're ever in New York, please come up. But it's quite amazing every morning to see our students, almost all low-income Black and Hispanic students in a very impoverished community in the Bronx, reciting these words together in unison. It's much different than just sort of reading them or sitting in your head, but together it's a collective commitment. Because any society that needs to be an effective self-governing, free society must have citizens within it who have committed to a set of common virtues. And so that's why we think this combination of a virtues-based education alongside teaching the Constitution, why it exists, we the people, the blessings of liberty. We're not relying upon someone else. We have the ability to govern ourselves.
And Attorney General Miyares, how does your family background inform your thinking about, what it means to have a government of limited power?
Right. I mean, I think any immigrant family that has come from an autocracy, their view is completely different than, unfortunately, I think most Americans that will take it for granted. I travel around Virginia a lot, and people ask me, what kind of name is Miyares anyway? And I like to say, well, it's Southern. It's really deep South. But those stories, in many ways, those emotional scars that go with your family and get passed on. My mother came from a society where the government decided and dictated your very future. The idea of having a written constitution in which actually limited government is actually rare. It's abnormal. It's never been tried before in all of human history. And I remember a story, hearing the very story. My uncle Angel Miyares got arrested during the Bay of Pigs invasion. Castro arrested anybody that could rise up against the government. And hearing the story of the Castro's police showing up in the middle of the night to arrest my uncle right in front of my mother, dragged him out. They didn't know where he was for several days. He thought they had just been summarily executed. It ended up going to an empty baseball stadium where he went through the humiliation of a mock execution. And I remember asking him as a young child, how in the world could they do this? I'd already been watching television shows like, how could they have arrested you with no trial? You didn't get a judge, you didn't read your rights? And he says, you don't understand. You live in a country with a Bill of Rights. I'm from a country that does not have that. That's actually one of the impetus, one of the early interests I had in the law. What was it about our system, even as a young child, that's different than even a country that's 90 miles off our coast? I had the honor of speaking to UVA Law School earlier this week, and I told those students, you think the way you live your life is normal. It is abnormal. It is utterly, completely abnormal if you look at the totality of human history. The vast, vast majority of people that have ever lived on this planet did not have freedom of speech or freedom of religion or the ability to cast a ballot for who their leaders are. We take that as just for granted as Americans. That is as normal as just breathing air. It's actually abnormal. It is rare. It is unique. It is precious. I call it the American miracle of what we have here. And we oftentimes take it for granted. And I tell my daughters all the time, gratitude is the most underrated of all human traits. And ingratitude is probably the ugliest, but gratitude's the most underrated. My feeling, going back to when we talk to young people today, is giving them that sense of gratitude. And I told those law students earlier this week, I said, we live in this remarkable moment where and I would say to everybody in this room, there are millions of people who woke up this morning on this planet just as smart as you, with just as much talent and ambition and hopes and dreams and desires. And they look at a map and they would do everything in their power. They would crawl over broken glass. They would tie inner tubes together and cross a shark-infested waterway or cling to the side of an airplane to be seated exactly where you're seated right now. My mother fled Cuba. She first went to Spain. And as I'd love to ask young people, why did she come here? What was so unique? Culturally, Spain was a much better fit for her. But it was because she had this overwhelming desire to live in a society that limited what government could do to her. And we take it for granted. It takes one act of parliament to abolish freedom of speech in England, a written constitution is a unique thing. And as Margaret Thatcher said, all the countries in Europe emerged out of history, and America is the only country to emerge out of a philosophy. Or as G.K. Chesterton said, America is the only country in the history of the world to be founded on a creed. Well, what is that creed? I think the American that encapsulated it was Dr. King on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, when he said those rights laid out in the Declaration of Independence of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. He called that the promissory note made to every American, past, present, and future. Now, as I challenge these UVA students, who wrote the promissory note? It's a quiet lawyer from Charlottesville. You can't really even say his name at UVA anymore. But he wrote the birth certificate of a nation, and it was another quiet, unassuming man from Orange County, Mr. Madison, who took those principles and incorporated the greatest written constitution in the history of the world and put forth the concept of ordered liberty. So I hope, as we have these great educators as well, that should be that sense of gratitude and almost awe that we set up this system that have allowed the greatest amount of human flourishing in human history. Not that we're perfect. Of course, we've had great imperfections in our history, but as we strive to that more perfect union, it's always been, and then I'll end with this, every time we've appealed to greater opportunity and rights and equality in American society, whether it's for African Americans or for women, what have we appealed to? Have we appealed to Rousseau? Do we appeal to Confucius? And that's why Lincoln was such a genius. He appealed to the principles laid out in the Declaration and then later incorporated into the Bill of Rights for every time that we've strived to go towards that more perfect union. And I think that's the type of educational principles that I hope that we have and we share with our young people, because I think it's going to be critical moving forward as we keep this republic.
Now Andy, as conservatives, of course, we have this great, wonderful opportunity right now, an opportunity with a lot of power in Washington to cut the government down to its constitutional size, or a little bit maybe in the direction of cutting it down to its constitutional size. We have, as we heard from one of the earlier panels, there's this movement of younger people more back towards the right. But at the same time, I think a lot of the younger people on the right haven't been educated in the constitutional system, maybe the way they didn't come to conservatism that way. And we have an administration that sometimes is chafing at the restraints. How do we square that circle? How do we teach those constitutional values even within our own party and our own movement when people are pushing at the restraints?
I think the main way is to not be so concerned about cutting the government down to size as it is to make it function properly as a constitutional republic. As majestic as the Bill of Rights is, to the framers it was almost an afterthought, because they believed the guarantor of liberty was separation of powers. And to the extent that our government doesn't function the way we would like to see it function, and the way it's designed to function in a messy, pluralistic, democratic society, I think there's been a breakdown in the separation of powers. And one of the things the framers were very worried about was the idea of too much different power accumulating in one set of hands. Mm-hmm. So as Justice Scalia pointed out in his famous dissent in Morrison versus Olson, the separation of powers concept in the Constitution built on earlier state constitutions in the colonies that basically stood for the proposition that the executive would never wield legislative and judicial power, and the legislature would never wield the other two, and neither the judiciary. And the idea was that that balance was what was necessary, that prevention of too much kind of power, particularly executive and legislative power, accumulating in one set of hands. That, to the framers, was the road to tyranny. And I think to the extent that we have dysfunction in the way our Constitution works today is we've gotten away from some basic ideas. I always, back in when we were having our arguments about the FISA court and a number of the other controversies that came up in the post 9/11 environment, I would always go back to some wisdom from Justice Robert Jackson, who was an iconic figure in American history, had been the prosecutor at Nuremberg, Attorney General to FDR, and then on the Supreme Court. And he was trying to make the point that the judiciary should stay out of the intelligence collection business. And he basically made 2 points. On the one hand, he would say that there's nothing about being a lawyer, even a lawyer with a robe, that makes you an expert in intelligence gathering. It's not within the ordinary skills of lawyers. That's an executive function. It's a quintessential political function. But then the other thing, they try to respond to that criticism by setting up a FISA court that would husband all of the intelligence matters in one place, and that was going to build the expertise up. But Justice Jackson's second criticism, I don't think they ever had a response to, or at least an adequate one, which was the decisions made by a body politic about its national security are the most important decisions that it makes. And those decisions have to be made by people who answer to the people whose lives are at stake. So you have to have a division of authority, but you also have to have a system where the most important decisions are actually made by people who are accountable to the voters. And I think to the extent that we have dysfunction, it's that over the last, really picking up steam, the last 75, 80 years, we've grown up what's almost a fourth branch of government, except it's very different from any other branch that this government ever knew, and certainly foreign to the ideas of the Constitution. We have a bureaucratic state, the administrative state, that makes some of the most important decisions that affect the lives of the body politic, and the American people can't reach it. So I don't think the problem is the size of it. I think the problem is we have to get the function right again, and it probably begins with Congress, which has become the most moribund of all the different branches. And I think a lot of times when we complain about, executive excess and the judges going wild and the administrative state prying into everything, a lot of the problem is Congress is AWOL. If Congress doesn't do its job, you're going to have a lot of actors in the system who do more than their job, and that's dangerous to liberty.
Yeah, our Congress has turned into the world's largest green room.
Oh my gosh, wow.
Well, Ian, you work in education policy. I mean, here we have a perfect example, right? The federal Department of Education, which is nowhere in Congress's enumerated powers to create. Trump is trying to cut it down to size. Musk is trying to cut it down to size. But I mean, how can you resize a federal department without Congress at least cutting its budget?
Yes. Well, I'll make one plug on Friday of last week. The Secretary of Education, Linda McMahon, visited Vertex Partnership Academies as the first school that she visited in the country out of 100,000 public schools. So it was quite an honor. And I think the reason she visited us is because of this idea that, we want our students to have a reverence for the Constitution, to understand how our system of government works. So we are this virtues-based education. It's quite amazing. If you work for, let's say you work for a large company, and there's a large national headquarters, and there are all these regional offices, and then one day you hear that at least half of the employees at the national headquarters were suddenly let go, and there was absolutely no impact to what is happening in each of the regional offices. That's what's happening right now. I mean, our schools are operating exactly the same. There is literally not a single impact. And so that is evidence, in my view, certainly, that whatever functions have been served by the department, I mean, spent more than $1 trillion since its inception. If you look at there are lots of graphs which show the amount of spending this way and student achievement this way. It's an absolutely legitimate question. Whether or not the actual department should exist, I do think there's certain incentives that the federal government could play in terms of reporting and assessment, to have a scorecard, which I think is really important to hold individual states accountable. But it shouldn't have been created in the first place. And certainly, even if there were a rationale, its performance has not demonstrated that it works for kids.
Now, Attorney General Miyares, your job, I guess, changes a bit with a more friendly administration as State Attorney General. But maybe you could talk a little bit about, the role that State Attorneys General play in our constitutional system, both when they are fundamentally on the same page as the White House and when they're not.
Well, I would like to touch a little bit to illustrate this, what Andrew noted about how the different branches of government are somewhat not functioning. Mr. Madison wrote in the Federalist paper this idea that each branch of government would jealously guard their power. I don't know if he anticipated what has occurred, where one branch of government has decided to essentially voluntarily give up their power, and he's noted it's Congress. My team in the AG's office in Virginia put together just an analysis of every law and regulations promulgated during the Biden administration. And what they discovered was less than 5% the laws and regulations impacting everyday Americans were actually acts of Congress. 95% were regulations promulgated from unelected administrative bodies or executive orders. Now, there's probably some at law schools and in journalism that think, well, that's the way it should be. I think that is a distortion of many ways of what our framers viewed, and I actually think it creates a level of distrust in government in general. You have some of the highest levels of distrust in public institutions that we've really seen in decades. And this somewhat became crystal clear for me early on when I had a dear friend of mine who runs a large trucking company in Virginia. And he called me about the OSHA regulations on the COVID-19 vaccine mandate. Do you all remember that? If you have 100 or more employees, you had to dictate that your employees, you had no choice, had to be vaccinated or be terminated. Vaccinated or terminated. Not an act of Congress, would impact close to 100 million Americans, not a debate in Congress, not debates in committees with testimony, not discussions on the floor of the Senate with the possibility of a filibuster, not a presidential pen to sign that legislation. It's OSHA, promulgated a regulation impacting roughly 1/3 of every American in the country, and it's an unelected body. And my friend told me, he's like, listen, I have long haulers who work for me, who've worked for me for decades. Amazing employees. I want to accommodate them as much as I can, and candidly, they're usually behind the wheel of a rig by themselves with nobody around them for hours upon hours in the day. And I have to tell these individuals that I have to now terminate you because they don't want to take the COVID-19 vaccine. And he asked me this question, which I thought was stunning. He goes, I know my congresswoman. I know how to get in touch with both senators. He said, have you ever tried to call the OSHA helpline to talk to anyone? Oh, blessedly no. He's like, well, let me tell you what I did. I got in the office, tracked down the number the night before. I put speaker on my office phone, and I called them at 8:30 in the morning. And when I left at 6 o'clock that night, I never got through to a single person. And the next day, I tried it again and never got through to anybody. Who do I talk to when I have something like this to explain that this is so destructive? Who do I hold accountable? And here's a dirty little secret. I would argue most members of Congress love this arrangement because members of Congress avoid hard votes like the Gobi Desert, okay? They don't want to be on the record. Do you think your average congressman or senator wants to vote to force employers to terminate their employees if they take the COVID-19 vaccine, or when they decided to promulgate a regulation putting biological boys in women's sports as they did to the Department of Education under the Biden administration. They don't want to take these hard votes. Yep. It's easy for them. And so it's in many ways a distortion of what was written in the Federalist Papers of this idea that Congress should jealously guard their power. The reality is they gave that power up. And our hope now is with Chevron deference overturning, we'll be able to challenge some of these rulings by the administrative state. But that's what we did, for example, in the Department of Education, as I mentioned, under Joe Biden. Suddenly decided to wave a magic wand and declare a civil rights law that had been on the books since 1972, protecting women, now included gender identity, and therefore you needed to indeed allow biological men on the women's sports teams. Well, some of us banded together and took them to court, and we won. And so I think that's one of those important roles that you have in the Attorney General's office. Now, right now we've come alongside the administration in his argument. I think it's a proper exercise of his Article 2 powers of saying, listen, we got to remove these TDA, these Tren de Aragua members, back to Venezuela. It's clear the Venezuelan government sent them here. They're one of the most notorious criminal enterprises on the planet. They come to the United States for one purpose and one purpose only, to terrorize fellow Americans and people living in this country. They need to be removed. And so in this case, that's on our side's arguing alongside that this is a proper exercise of the president's Article 2 powers. So, it's an issue by issue basis, but you could see with the roles that these AGs, and what I've also argued as well, particularly when you're dealing with the administrative state, is the great irony is state AGs have become more important as Congress failed to do their job. That's kind of the great irony that we've seen around the country.
I mean, it seems crazy to a lot of people, and sometimes it is crazy, to let an individual district judge issue a nationwide injunction that essentially takes power out of the hands of the executive branch for the whole country. And yet, at the same time, I think we all want to see there be an avenue that works of judicial review to challenge executive actions that, as we saw so often during the Biden administration and sometimes during the Trump years, that exceeds constitutional power. Is there a better mousetrap? Is there a better way to do this that doesn't involve, running to the District of Hawaii to see if you can have one judge who will govern the whole country until the appeals courts can get involved?
That's a great question. I don't know. I mean, forum shopping has become a feature of the system. Both sides do it. During the Biden years and the Obama years, the courts of Texas were extraordinarily busy, thanks to you, Attorney General guys. And now we have, was the judge in Hawaii was Obama's law school classmate, wasn't he? So we had a border crisis stateside, and all the cases were brought to the District of Hawaii. Imagine that. Maybe because both sides do it, it's a wash. I think it would be helpful to try to move these cases if there was a mechanism to move them faster up to the appellate courts, where you have less of the specter of one judge in a single district making policy for the whole country. That would be maybe a better result. But I think the problem that we have here, to my mind, is more cultural than legal. I mean, obviously this is a legal problem because you have an unelected judge making such decisions. But when I was a young prosecutor in New York, Bob Morgenthau had been was the district attorney of New York County for years. He had been the U.S. attorney in the Southern District of New York for years before that. When he ran the DA's office as Alvin Bragg now runs it. If you campaign, because that's an elective office, if you campaign for office saying, elect me and I will use the powers of the office against our political rivals, that would have been deemed disqualifying. They would have, they would sooner have run you up to Bellevue than made you the Manhattan district attorney. And yet, flash forward 20 years, Tish James, the Attorney General in New York, makes precisely that argument, and she's running for statewide office, right? She wins by 30 points. And I think at the same time, when I was a young prosecutor in eons ago, judges used to care about being reversed. Now, the fraught politics that we have in elective office, I think, has spilled over into the judiciary as well, to the point where I think you have ideological judges, and to my mind, they're almost exclusively progressive judges. I know there are judges on the hard right too, but the difference between the right-wing judges and the left-wing judges is the right-wing judges think the Constitution needs to govern. They're more process-oriented, right? They're not trying to get a conclusion or an outcome. They're trying to make sure that the decision is made in the right place. The progressives want an outcome. But when I was a young prosecutor, they used to care about being reversed. Now they care about being on the right side. So I read a lot of these decisions now, and I think they're like abjectly wrong. And I know, because I know some of these people, that they're not dumb. These are not stupid lawyers. I can only think that they're trying to campaign for the next judicial office, or that they want to be superstars in the movement. And I think if you end up breeding a culture, especially in the judiciary, where they're trying to score political points for their side rather than trying to get it right, to apply the law in a way that gets to the right result, then that's catastrophic. And to me, that's a bigger problem than, if it was one district judge making policy for the whole country, but the culture of the judiciary predominantly was, let's get this right, it wouldn't be so much of a problem. They go to particular judges because they know they're going to get a particular outcome. That's politics. That's not the law.
All right, let's see if we can take some questions.
All right, Dan, we have a question here. Even though any civilized person finds Mahmoud Khalil's opinions reprehensible, does his deportation for legal activity give you any pause?
It doesn't give me pause, because I think in this instance, rather than making it up on the fly, we have a congressional statute that treats, even though the law, generally speaking, treats aliens differently depending on where they are in the sliding scale of intimacy with our society, as you run from illegal aliens who shouldn't be here all the way to the top of lawful permanent resident aliens, green card holders. There's a lot of places in the law where those distinctions make a difference. There's three areas that they don't. If you've been involved in criminal activity, if you've been involved in terrorist activity, or if the Secretary of State, pursuant to a congressional grant of authority, which means essentially the executive branch, but the Secretary of State is the main actor here, makes a decision that your continuing presence in the United States is a threat to our foreign policy interests in the world. Congress gave the Secretary of State and the executive branch that power. I think it was appropriate to give it to that part of the government, and I would be very surprised if a judge was presumptuous enough to say that he or she, rather than the Secretary of State, ought to be making decisions about what affects American foreign policy.
Yeah, and I think it's important to remember that we're talking here about protests that went a good deal beyond just speech. And I think the administration probably is going to be able to show that Khalil had at least some level of involvement and participation in acts that go beyond speech. And I think we do have a foreign policy interest in projecting to the world that our campuses are, yes, they are safe places for speech. They're not safe places from speech, but they are safe places for people all around the world even, not just Americans, to attend without being terrorized over a foreign policy dispute.
And as someone who runs schools in the K-12 system, it's also a shining light for us. Why is it that college students believe that the only way to rectify arguments is to go beyond speech and start barricading violence? And so there's the issue of, which I agree with you, Andy, it certainly seems that this went beyond speech, and it's certainly in the Secretary of State's discretion. But how do we ensure more young people understand constructive dialogue or dialoguing across difference? The most powerful weapon you have is your intellect and information, evidence, and discussion, not resorting to violence. And so it's also a wake-up call for us in the K-12 system that we've got to be better preparing our students before they enter higher education.
I mean, I kind of a perspective. My mother came here as a green card holder, and she shared with me before she was allowed to get that green card, the level of questioning that she had to answer before they would give her that privilege, and it was a privilege. She had to discuss whether she had any ties to the Cuban communist regime, the Communist Party, an entity that had interest aligned against the United States. She had to produce an affidavit that she had to turn over to the government, to immigration authorities, from somebody in the United States saying that she would not be a burden upon the United States, that she would actively seek employment and would not simply be there to get benefits, right? A very, very different world that she entered into, but it just goes to show in many ways how this is broken, and I somewhat agree with what Secretary Rubio noted, that when he applied for this green card, they would never give my mother a green card if she said, no, I want to show up to the United States and align myself with the Communist Party of America protesting the Vietnam War and all these subversive activities. They would have said, very nice to meet you, stay in Spain, right? And as Secretary Rubio noted, if he had noted what his activities were going to be, they would have never given him that green card to begin with because you are a guest. And so I think those are pretty powerful points on that whole matter. And we'll see where the courts rule on this.
Okay. I have a question here for Attorney General Miyares. Can you speak to the role of your office in dismantling the left-wing ideological grip on Virginia schools?
Oh, gosh. It's another hour or so. I think we all recognize that the educational system has been broken. Sometimes people ask me, when did you think that you all were going to win in 2021? I remember not too far from here, we were at the old farmers market in Old Town Alexandria. We did a rally. Governor Youngkin spoke, and then afterwards, and I had spoken. Remember a constituent came up and she said, I just want you to know I've never voted for a Republican in my life. I'm voting for a Republican for the first time now. And I said, well, I'm honored to have your vote. Do you mind telling me why? And she said, yeah, because you have a lot of politicians and bureaucrats that have forgotten a really important truth. Never, ever, ever get between a mother and her child. And I just said, yes, ma'am. I mean, forget that. But I do think it is one of the grave moments that we have, I think, as an elected official or even in the conservative movement. People ask me sometimes, what keeps you up at night? And for me, it's when you see polling that shows only 1/3 of young people, ages 18 to 29, say they have a love of America. A free society is not going to remain a free society if you have an entire generation of young people that don't understand the principles of what made this the last best hope on earth. So thank you for your work. And I would say that, Plato noted the two most important questions for a civilization is this: who teaches the children, and what do they teach them, right? So I think if there's anything the post-COVID world has shown is a white-hot spotlight the parents started to see what their children were learning in school with great concern. And to show you how distorted this has been, actually, I was speaking to a Chamber of Commerce group yesterday, and I pointed this out to them. I think one of the most recent, critically important dates in modern American history was December 4th, 2024. And I don't assume everybody here knows what happened on that date. That was the date that Brian Thompson, the CEO of United Healthcare, was gunned down.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just the fact that he was tragically murdered in broad daylight in New York City. It was the reaction after that. 81% of American college students have a negative view of Brian Thompson. 48% of American college students, now think about this, this is not the general population. These are our college students, our future lawyers, judges, members of the media, elected officials. Half of our American college students say the murder of a business leader in broad daylight that orphaned 2 small children was justified. Was justified. I remember asking my mother, how in the world did Cuba become Marxist? I like to point out the year Fidel Castro took power in Cuba, Cuba had the same GDP as Italy, and the year that he died, Cuba had the same GDP as Sudan. I use that illustration, socialism doesn't really work. But she said, once Castro promised elections, he took over, and then you almost immediately saw, both in the state-controlled media and in academia and in discussion, that everybody in society was labeled one of 2 things: oppressor and oppressed. And she said, you can justify unspeakable horror if you're doing it on behalf of the oppressed against the oppressor. Or as C.S. Lewis noted, of all the tyrannies in the world, the worst tyrannies are the tyrannies done for your own good, right? And that's why we've had such a focus on our education system, K through 12 and higher ed. As Governor Youngkin likes to say, we should be teaching our children how to think, not what to think. And obviously, the University of Virginia just voted unanimously to abolish DEI at their school. I believe in equality of opportunity, not equality of outcome. That's America. So it is a heavy lift, but I would say be ever vigilant. And I think it's really, I tell people, your school board races are the most important elections you never pay attention to. Because for years, conservatives haven't paid attention. Your school boards really do control so much of the curriculum in your local school district. Get involved and candidly run for school board.
And I would just add, maybe to end, de Tocqueville in Democracy in America, he said that the greatness of America lies not in being more exceptional or enlightened than any other nation. It's in her ability to repair her faults. And it's a really powerful statement because it suggests that our country has the tools of self-renewal, of self-betterment. The Constitution, the Bill of Rights, the Declaration of Independence. Those are the tools that our system uses to become a better nation. And the reason our students recite the preamble to the Constitution is that we want them to know that they have the tools of self-renewal and self-betterment within themselves. And that's how we carve out the future of our nation.
Or as Churchill said, Americans always do the right thing after they've exhausted all their options. So
Right.
Maybe not as eloquent as de Tocqueville.
There you go.
All right, well, thanks again to all of our panelists. Thanks to our sponsors.